writers and people who follow these issues, we've often come up with, against the terms sound science. Seems like there's my science, then there's your science, then there's the best science, the sound science, the adaptive science. And one of the most important things is how to communicate your science or the science to the public and get them interested in this without their eyes glazing over. Someone who's good at this because of his classroom experience, I think that's maybe, you've got to keep those students awake, right? Yes, that's the key, is Jeff Mount. And Jeff is here today to talk about the issue of communicating science with the public. He's also going to blend in a little bit of the PPIC report, which you heard this morning. He's one of the authors of that. But mainly he's going to talk about science. He is a professor in the Department of Geology at UC Davis, and he's author of the book California Rivers and Streams, co-author, like I said, of the recent PPIC report. He currently holds an endowed chair in applied geoscience at UC Davis and is the founding director of the UC Davis Center for Watershed Science. He is a member of the National Academy of Science Committee on the Klamath River. He co-chaired the CalFed Independent Science Board and is currently a member of the Delta Independent Science Board. So his science credentials are there. So please join me in welcoming Jeff.
Thank you, Rita. Okay, so you've had a big lunch, and I gather there was some wardrobe failure with the earlier PowerPoint that occurred. And I'm going to take a great risk. I have been teaching and lecturing with PowerPoint since it became part of our DNA in 1997. And in that time, I have done more than 1,000 PowerPoint talks. And an average of 30 slides per PowerPoint, that's 30,000 slides since 1997. And can anybody here remember one of those slides? If you can, then you are the exception. You were the only one awake. So along to this communicating science issue, this notion of me taking a risk and not using PowerPoint, which by the way, I did prepare a PowerPoint slide for this, show for this, and the great irony of preparing that PowerPoint hit me in the face, and I said, hey, Calvin, I'm actually going to give a talk without PowerPoint.
Can you do it?
This is it. I'm already extremely nervous about not having my crutch, which those of you who use PowerPoint all the time, this is your crutch. This keeps you standing up. So instead, I brought my iPad. Which is my crutch. But you'll see why I've got such bad things to say about PowerPoint as I go through this in terms of communicating science. So what I'm actually doing today is I'm blending a couple of things together. And Rita's right. I'm going to blend a little bit of discussion about the communication of science, but I'm also going to talk really more in depth about the condition of science today in this system. We hear every politician say we need to have science-based decisions. We hear everyone who has a decision say it's science-based. We hear the phrase science all the time, and together we did this morning. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from the book that you were discussing this morning, and this is Managing California's Water from Conflict to Reconciliation. You can imagine we grappled with that title a great deal. And that was a project led principally by Ellen Hannock and Jay Lund, involving Ariel Dinar from UC Riverside, Buzz Thompson from Stanford, Brian Gray from Hastings School of Law, and the usual the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they call it sometimes, me, Jay Lund, Peter Moyle, and Richard Howard. We've actually since then renamed ourselves to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which Ellen does not appreciate.
No.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on what we talked about a bit, about science communication in the book. As you know, the book's about 500 pages long, so you may not have found that part in it, that nugget in those discussions. But also at the end, I want to make sure that if you have questions based on this morning about some of the conclusions of the book, or things you really hated in the book, by all means, in the question and answer, if I don't cover them, bring them back. Okay, first of all, I'm going to focus on the Delta because it still remains the most interesting, most significant, most intractable, wicked problem in water in the West. And nothing has changed since I said that 10 years ago. It remains so. Really, nothing has changed. It's most important. But I want to talk about science in this system. First of all, I sat down and did counted more than 100 separate entities which are currently either funding or conducting science within the Delta. That's 100. That's federal, state, local agency scientists. Their engineers, their technicians are matched in number by an army of consultants, many of whom are sitting here today. So it is an extraordinary amount of science that's being done and work. And I can't actually tell you how many people are involved. No one can tell you how many people are involved. It does seem like we recycle the faces, mine being one of them, on a regular basis, but it's an immense number of people. And moreover, I can't tell you if anybody's in charge. In fact, no one's in charge. There are so many different things going on in just the Delta alone. It's not chaos. It is, in fact, a scientific adhocracy. That's the best way I can describe it. It is, in fact, an adhocracy. It is ad hoc, and it is its own institution amongst itself. This is one of the more fundamental challenges for communicating science. There is no single voice of science within this. There is no single authority that people go to in science. I'm on the Independent Science Board. We're not considered an authority of any kind. I work with the Delta Science Program, which has no authority whatsoever, thanks to the 2009 legislative package. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So when we jump into the discussion about science communication, we start with pointing at scientists who can't get their message down to simple forms that people can understand. The sort of usual grinding on that. I'm going to focus a little more on what sits underneath the infrastructure underneath these scientists, and something to think about. At the top of okay, so now comes my rant. Brace yourself. Okay, so at the top of the list, I got 5 things to rant about. It's not news to any of you in this room that one of the most difficult tasks facing sort of the organized distribution and expression of science is the inability of the agencies, the various agencies, to, I call it, paddle together. I really do view it like going down a whitewater river and nobody's paddling together, so your boat's kind of spinning along in this. The support of decision-making in the Delta requires the agencies to be very cooperative with each other and not sing necessarily the same tune, but to adequately share resources in a very, very effective way. And although this hurts some feelings when I say that, they do not. And I've sat on the Independent Science Board in various forms for the last 10 years and watched this process go on. I mean, and actually I'll give you some examples. And of course the National Research Council came out here, and I'll get to why they were here in a second as another element of the science that's done. And they had very cross words for the science adhocracy of the Delta. And those cross words focused on one of those fundamental problems. And the problem is that, well, we're going to coordinate. And when I hear, well, we're going to coordinate, what I know that means is, well, we're going to have a lot of meetings. Because that's all some people are going to do with their lives is go to meetings. And anybody who has spent the last 10 years in the Delta know that you have more meetings than you have actual productive time in the science community these days. The National Research Council said coordination is not integration. What is missing in this adhocracy is some way to integrate the science. This would help our cause and communication immensely if we could somehow integrate this. Let me give you some examples. And again, by the way, by the end of this talk, I hope that I have insulted everyone in the room at some point. So let me give you one that really will drive a couple of people nuts. Did anybody bother to read the interim state plan of flood control that was released? I mean, the interim document described what they're doing? In it, I searched it. It never mentioned once the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. Yet what's going to happen in that flood plan has an immense impact on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. Didn't even mention it once. And only twice that I could find did it even mention the Delta Stewardship Council and the creation of the Delta Plan. Well, it turns around, what goes around comes around. If you look at the Bay Delta Plan, they don't actually seem to be aware that a whole big, huge planning effort is underway to manage floods in the Central Valley. The Delta Stewardship Council and their plan, and of course it isn't a plan now, it's a series of notes, I think is the best way to describe it at this point, barely recognizes state plan of flood control. It does mention it briefly, and then says we're going to defer to BDCP. This sort of level of confusion in these organizations is fundamentally characteristic to the scientific adhocracy. And I think this is one of those things we really have to get at. Same occurs on the federal side, of course. It's not just the state as well. The second part that we deal with in science in this system, and now I would normally go to the next slide on my PowerPoint. The second obvious challenge for this is one that has been particularly aggravating that I have personally taken great advantage of. And that is the boom-bust cycles that we have in funding in this system. this seems like a very mundane topic to most of you in this room, but imagine that you have this massive infrastructure, which is built around the Delta. And that infrastructure depends on the flow of money, because money comes in, and people do research, they collect information, and that money is what makes it work. But what we've had is this addiction, I'm not the first time we say this, addiction to the general obligation bond style of funding. And this has produced these spectacular periods of massive infusion of money, and we all know what happened in early CalFed here, when obscene sums of money flowed into the adhocracy. And of course, the agencies just weren't able to choke it down. But the universities were perfectly happy to take your money, and the consultants, you know what the motto of all consulting firms is, we can do that. And they did. And we choked down a tremendous amount of money in this system episodically as we sold bonds. This is a silly way to fund science. In fact, I will argue it's so counterproductive as to be a very large waste of money. That we could deliver a much higher quality science in this system if we had a little more organization and a little steadying of the resources. There's rampant inefficiencies associated with this. And I know, I'm at the university. We were the ones who were always trying to choke down that money when it would appear there, and then we would be starving in between. And of course, that's no way to run an adhocracy, as I say. So smoothing this out is one of the biggest problems that we've seen. Indeed, I want to tell you, the other side of this is that as a funding model, this is one of the great failures of the 2009 legislative package. Jared's here, and I've heard his feelings on this. Oh, good. He's good. Before I've heard his feelings, he's left. Then in my lifetime, the two packages, the 2006-07 flood package and the 2009 water package, in my adult career, those are the biggest single legislative packages that we've had on water in California in my adult life. But they still have lots of warts in them. And one of the biggest warts of the 2009 package is they didn't come up with a funding mechanism. And so they left it out there. And I forget the phrase unfunded mandate. Had they been able to fund it, even at a lower level, in some way which is relatively steady, this would have been far greater for the science. So we have today a Delta Science program, which based on the 2009 legislative package, is supposed to coordinate science in the Delta, which means a lot of meetings. And what are we doing? How are we funding it? We borrowed the money. We borrowed the money through general obligation bond funds to keep a science program going. And I will argue, and I'm happy to argue with any of you here, that the science program is as integral as any levee, as any dam, any of your physical infrastructure. Without a good science program, you really do suffer. So, I will argue that's one of the five big problems. The third, again, destined to annoy some of you, we are driven by crisis science. So, you can get your act together on communication all you want. You can guarantee that once a year, here in California, we'll have some new water crisis. And then we will be chasing that crisis. First of all, I'm sympathetic to this. Some years ago, I studied what happens in flood control and the response of people to floods, major flood events, and there's all kinds of things, interesting things happen psychologically to people. For example, I've given this talk with the Water Education Foundation before. It's really interesting to see what happens after a flood is who emotionally recovers more quickly. It turns out if you've got somebody to blame, you actually recover more quickly. So you're a fool to accept personal responsibility for your poor choice of a place to live. It's a whole lot better to blame the Army Corps of Engineers. There might be some reasonable, rational reason for that. But one of the things that helps you get over a disaster or a crisis is the appearance that somebody's doing something. In the Pacific Northwest, they call it yellow metal madness. After all floods, everybody fires up their tractors and drives them around and pushes dirt around, even though it doesn't really make a difference. It makes people feel a whole lot better. I suspect that the legislature responds that way. So when we have a crisis, we need to look like we're doing something. It is terrible for your scientific community here to constantly be responding to these crises. And what we have during these crises is the need to appear to do something causes the legislature to start to herd the scientific communities. Let me give you an example. So during the drought crisis, we were having a significant reduction of exports from the Delta, partially due to the drought, partially due to environmental regulations, usually described incorrectly as entirely due to environmental regulations. But regardless regardless, we had that during all that time, and there was this demand to do something. So a very smart engineer, who many of you know, Dennis Majors, from Metropolitan Water District, came up with an idea of putting operable gates in the delta, which might be able to control flows in a way which might actually keep delta smelt away from the pumps, because it might have been that smelt were attracted to turbidity. None of the science was ready for that idea. Maybe some of the engineering, but none of the science was ready for that idea. That idea came out, and in the crisis mentality of the time, it moved from, hey, kind of a good idea, all the way to legislation. And it became part of the legislative package itself. Was it two gates? The Two Gates project. This is 2 gates in the delta, which would then control how turbidity moves down toward the pumps. This was a classic case of crisis science. I often call it look busy science. I mean, you've got to really be busy. Now,